In this lesson, we're going to expand on what you know about the composition of living things. And this time we're going to talk about how all those molecules that you're made of change from one form to another. Something to keep in mind is that it's not just what we're made up of that's important, but it's actually what goes on inside our bodies, because if we didn't have constant changes going on and changes in molecules, then you would not be able to grow and develop and reproduce and interact with the environment around you. Let's focus on the key concepts that you should be learning from this lesson. The first one is we want you to think about what happens to the chemical bonds during chemical reactions. And the second point is that we want you to understand that in chemical reactions that there are going to be changes in the chemical bonds that hold atoms together. So as an example of this, I'd like for you to look at this molecule of ethanol. And at this point, I think all of you would know where the chemical bonds are located on this model. And if you said to yourself that they were located right here between the different circles that represent the atoms in this molecule, then you would be correct. Now, if you look at ethanol, which is this molecule, and you consider that it will burn, and when it burns, it's going to combine with oxygen. After it's all said and done, and you have a lot of energy being released, these are the molecules that you have left over. And so look at this and think about the bonding that you saw first in the ethanol, and then finally in the products at the end. And so that means that we had a lot of changes in the bonds that are holding the atoms together. First, let's get our definition for a chemical reaction. A chemical reaction is a process that changes or transforms one set of chemicals into another by changing the chemical bonds that hold these atoms together in those compounds. Now, if we stop and think about it for a moment, we know that changes in matter can be chemical or they can be physical. Now, if I were thinking about just a physical change, one example that you see here is the boiling of water. You know that's a physical change because you know that the vapors that are escaping from that boiling water can recondense and make the liquid water again. So we can get that substance back. But if you think about what happens as iron rust, you would remember that you can't get the iron back after this rust without having this undergo a lot of chemical changes. So rust will not go back to iron without having another chemical change take place. We're going to talk about a very important natural law, and that is the law of conservation of mass and energy. And in this law, we know that matter and energy are not created or not destroyed during a chemical reaction. It's all here somewhere. It's just been rearranged, and the energy has moved from one place to another. Now, what we're looking at this point is a chemical equation. A chemical equation is a shorthand way to look at what's going on in a chemical change. So we would read this particular chemical equation as glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide plus water. Now, when we look at this, you can see that we have equal numbers of every kind of atom, both before the reaction starts and after the reaction has occurred. So that means that matter was not created or destroyed in this chemical reaction. Yes, there's more to this. We need to attribute some terms to these parts of a chemical reaction. And so what we're going to do is use the term reactants for the elements or compounds that we have before the chemical reaction takes place. And we're going to use the term products for what we have after the chemical change has occurred. So in our example then, The glucose and the oxygen are the reactants, and the carbon dioxide and the water are the products. Let's think about, look at this equation in terms of conservation of mass. How many atoms are present in the reactants? And so what you would do is come to the equation and you would add up all of the atoms that are present in the glucose. And then you're going to add to that the number of atoms that are present in the oxygen. Now you may not know this, but the 6 in front of the O2 means that you're going to multiply that. So altogether that means that we have 36 atoms present in the reactants. Now if you compare that to the atoms that are present in the products, we have the same amount. It's just that the atoms have all been rearranged, and in the process some energy was released, and so there it is. That's conservation of mass. The reason that we're talking about this is because we're interested in the chemical reactions that take place in living things. And one example of this is what happens in your body in order to rid itself of the carbon dioxide that is produced as the cells in your body convert the glucose over to carbon dioxide and water so that you can have energy. And so this carbon dioxide is produced in your cells, and then it enters the blood. And once in the bloodstream, that carbon dioxide is going to react with water. So we're here on our picture. And it's going to form carbonic acid. Now in the form of carbonic acid, this carbon dioxide can move through your bloodstream and go to your lungs. And once this gets to your lungs, then the carbon dioxide will come off of that compound and will be released into the air so that you can expel it. More information on energy. So let's think about a couple of more things that are extraordinarily important in this story about how life continues. We're going to think about how energy changes affect whether a chemical reaction will occur or not. And we're going to think about the fact that chemical reactions that release energy on their own can spontaneously. Chemical reactions that absorb energy will not occur without a source of energy to get it started. So try to keep these points in mind as we go forward. Let's get the basic points down first. Let's go through them. Energy is released or absorbed whenever the chemical bonds are formed or broken during chemical reactions. And the second point is that the energy changes are one of the most important factors in determining whether a chemical change will occur. Our third point, chemical reactions that release energy often occur on their own or spontaneously. And our fourth point, chemical reactions that absorb energy will not occur without a source of energy. As an example of an energy-releasing reaction, let's think about what happens when hydrogen gas combines with oxygen. And this is actually a burning reaction. There's so much energy produced from this that we can see it as heat and light. And the process continues until all the hydrogen and the oxygen that are available have combined to make water. So as strange as it may seem when you look at this, hydrogen gas plus oxygen gas will combine in a violent reaction and actually produce water. Focus on the illustration for a moment. These molecules represent the oxygen and these represent the hydrogen. And so when they come together, the reaction begins. Afterwards you have water remaining. And during the process, huge amounts of energy are released. You might think about the burning of the Hindenburg at this point. The reverse reaction, in which your water is changed back to hydrogen and oxygen gas, absorbs so much energy that it generally doesn't occur by itself. And in other words, you don't see water converting back to hydrogen and oxygen in nature. The only way that you can get that to happen would be if you supply a great deal of energy to the process. It's almost like you take the same amount of energy that went all out of the reaction when the hydrogen and oxygen combine. Well, you've got to put energy back into it in order to get back to the hydrogen and oxygen separately. So, in one direction, the reaction produces energy, and in the other direction, the reaction requires energy. These points are actually some more basic ideas to keep in mind about chemical reactions in living things. First, every organism, whether it's you or a bacteria, has to have a source of energy in order to carry out chemical reactions to stay alive. Second, plants get their energy from the sun, and you know that plants, being green, carry on photosynthesis, and so they are able to take the sunlight and put that into compounds such as glucose. They can use that energy, and thankfully we as animals are able to get that energy as we consume these plants or we consume animals that have eaten those plants. Next, humans release the energy needed to grow, breathe, think, and dream through chemical reactions in our body. So when we consume food, we have a lot of chemical reactions that are taking place inside us to digest that food, and so we have to break it down into individual molecules, that is, into smaller parts, and then in our cells we're going to recombine those molecules in order to make cells that are of our body and not of the plant or animal from which we are getting that energy. Thankfully, chemical reactions that release energy don't always occur spontaneously, and it's a good thing, because if you think about it, a candle that's sitting on the shelf doesn't just automatically ignite all by itself. The only way that you can get it to burn and use the energy that's stored in that wax is if you strike the match and apply that energy to the candle to begin with. And so that energy that you have to supply in order to get the candle to burn is called the activation energy. And so when we look at this photo, you know that this candle will not begin to burn unless you supply this activation energy to the process to begin with. There's a lot of important information on this page, so pay close attention. We're going to look at the graphs that you have and think about activation energy, the energy that are in reactants, and the energy that are in products. First of all, let's look at the graph. At the bottom, we have the course of the reaction that occurs over time. And up the side, we're thinking about the level of energy that's involved. Now, at this point on our graph, this is the energy that all the reactants contain. And after the chemical reaction, this is the amount of energy that the products contain. Now, because the energy in the products is much higher on the graph than the energy that was in the reactants, we know that energy went into those products. But look at this. The energy in the reactants is at this level. The energy that's in the products is at this level. However, the total amount of energy involved in this chemical reaction actually went to this level. So the difference there is actually the activation energy that went in to get this chemical reaction to start. Now, this is called an energy absorbing reaction because the energy of the product is greater than the energy of the reactants. Now, on the other side of this story, if we look at the energy of the reactants and compare that to the energy of the products, you can see that our products, in this case, do not have as much energy as our reactants did originally. And so in this case, this is the initial amount of energy in our reactants, and this is the amount in our products. But if we look at this line, we can see that the area from here to here is actually much higher on the graph, and so that meant that there had to be some activation energy supplied to this chemical reaction to get it to proceed. But once the reaction was started, it proceeded on its own, and it gave off a lot of energy. We need an example of this. Let's look at this simple illustration. Think about activation energy. On this side of our graph, wood and oxygen are going to be our reactants. And again, you know that if you have wood laying around and there's oxygen in the air, it doesn't burn on its own. But you do know that if you get it started, that you're going to get a whole lot of energy out of that wood. And so when we look at this, this is our initial energy level for the wood and oxygen. This is our final energy level for the carbon dioxide and water. And so the difference in the energy from those 2 points is the amount of energy that goes off into the atmosphere. Now, in this illustration, we can see that we have this initial energy level that's present in the wood and oxygen. And then, of course, this is our energy in the products. But instead of just going straight down the slope like this, we know that you have to get this process started. In other words, you have to light the match in order to get that wood and oxygen to begin the chemical reaction. So that energy that you have to supply to get that burning reaction started is just the activation energy. We need a little bit of voice with this, so let's try this again. What I want you to think about here is bond energy. So let's review. When bonds are made, energy goes into a compound. Now, in this case, you're looking at energy from the sun, and you know that when energy from the sun combined is used to put carbon dioxide and water together, that you make glucose. And so you're making a lot of bonds and putting that energy into that compound. When that cow consumes the food that was in that plant, that cow gets the energy, and that cow is going to have a lot of metabolic processes go on that actually break down molecules and then recombine them to make, for instance, the muscle that's in that cow. Then along you come. You eat the hamburger, maybe with the lettuce and tomato. But when you consume that food material, your body is going to break down those molecules. So when you break those bonds, you're going to get energy out of this process. So this is what it's all about. Chemical bonds are always being made and being broken. And so when bonds are made, energy is going to go into them. And when the bonds are broken, energy is going to go out.